Clara was used to taking care of children, but nothing prepared her for what she would find at the Blackwood mansion. The hiring had been quick, almost no questions asked, and the tempting offer, a generous payment for a single night's work. The mansion was isolated on a hill, far from the city and hidden among trees that seemed to have never seen the light of day. The idea of being alone in such a remote place made her feel a mixture of excitement and discomfort, but the need for money made her accept the job. When she arrived, the house looked even more imposing and strange than she imagined. The windows were covered with heavy red velvet curtains, and the garden, a maze of shrubs and dried trees, was poorly maintained, with dead flowers and leaves strewn on the ground as if time had stopped there. The sharp wind blew through the trees, creating an almost disturbing sound, as if nature itself was mumbling secrets. Mrs. Blackwood, an old woman with empty and deep eyes, received Clara with a smile that seemed more like a grimace. Her husband, a thin and pale man, barely looked at her, preferring to stand in a corner of the room as if he was absorbed in his own thoughts. They did not mention anything about the history of the mansion or about the child. They only said that Alice, their daughter, was a lovely girl but somewhat peculiar. "Alice is upstairs. She will be happy to have you as company," said Mrs. Blackwood, gesturing vaguely to the second floor. Clara climbed the noisy wooden staircase, her boots echoing through the silent corridors. The sound was deep and reverberated as if the house was alive, watching each movement. Upon arriving in Alice's room, the door opened with a creak, revealing a girl of about 8 years old, sitting in a corner of the room, eyes fixed on the window. "Alice?" Clara called, trying to make the girl notice her. Alice slowly turned her head, and Clara felt a shiver run through her spine. There was something in the child's eyes that did not seem normal. It was as if she was looking at Clara, but at the same time was in another place, in another time. "Are you the babysitter?" Alice asked, her voice soft and almost melancholy. "He will be happy with your arrival." Clara frowned. "Who will be happy?" "The guardian. He lives in the crypt. He is always looking." Alice's words were said so casually that Clara didn't know how to react. She laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. "The crypt, huh? Where is it?" Alice pointed to the garden with a strange smile. "He lives there, underground. He watches me all the time. He never leaves." Clara felt a shiver when she heard the child speak with such contempt about something so macabre. She tried to change the subject, sitting in the chair next to Alice's bed and starting to talk about more normal things, movies, toys, stories. But the girl seemed distant, as if her words were spoken by someone else. The night passed slowly, and Clara found herself increasingly restless. Alice began to talk more and more about the guardian, saying things that made no sense, as if she was describing someone she knew personally, but Clara could not understand the meaning of his words. In a moment, Alice got up from her bed and went to the window, looking at the garden with a lost look. "He's there," she muttered, her eyes glazed. "He's calling me." Clara tried to calm the girl, but something in the atmosphere of the house seemed heavy and oppressive, as if she was being watched. The wind howled from outside, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, following every step she took. However, what really bothered her was when Alice looked directly at her and with a disturbing smile whispered, "You will be the next." Clara swallowed dry, trying to drive away the strange thoughts that began to take over his mind. It was just a child with a fertile imagination, she said to herself. But the discomfort she felt did not go away. She lay down in bed, trying to ignore what Alice had said. But the girl's whispers, now softer, continued to echo in her mind, "The guardian, he will not stop until he has what he wants." That night, Clara could not sleep. She was listening to the sound of the wind and the murmurs of Alice coming from the other side of the room. Something was wrong at the Blackwood mansion. Something she still couldn't understand, but felt much closer than she thought. And as she looked out the window, Claire saw a shadowy figure moving slowly through the garden towards the crypt. The wind carried a smell of rot, and fear began to take hold of his body. The guardian was waiting. The next morning, Clara woke up with the first rays of light infiltrating through the heavy curtains of Alice's room. The tiredness was deep, but not as much as the discomfort that still accompanied her. The silence of the mansion seemed suffocating, and Alice's behavior made her feel increasingly anxious. The girl had spoken again about the guardian during the night, but now, when Clara looked for her, Alice was silent, with a vague look in her eyes, as if nothing had happened. Clara tried to concentrate on her work. He made breakfast and tried to talk to the Blackwoods, but the answers were short and evasive. Lord Blackwood seemed lost in his thoughts, while Lady Blackwood was distant, almost absorbed in a solitary task that Clara could not identify. There was no more reference to the guardian. It was as if the subject had been forbidden from being discussed. However, Clara could not get the words of Alice out of her head. "He lives in the crypt. He watches me." What would that be? Was it just a child's imagination? Or was there something else, something that could not be ignored? She needed to understand. After leaving Alice in her bed for a nap in the middle of the afternoon, Clara decided to investigate alone. The garden, with its maze of shrubs and blackened trees, seemed to hide more than just dried plants. The wind still whistled between the leaves, but there was a strange in the air, something that made Clara's skin shiver. She followed in Alice's footsteps, walking towards the place that the girl had pointed out the night before. The crypt was in the center of the garden, disguised under the blanket of moss and thick roots. The entrance was a broken stone arch, as if it had been forgotten by time. Clara knelt near the entrance and began to remove the moss and leaves that covered the crypt base. She saw something that made her freeze, an esoteric symbol, engraved in stone. It was a drawing she recognized from some ancient reading, a mark associated with rituals of possession, an invocation of evil entities. As Clara examined the symbol, a feeling of foreboding took hold of her body. The wind increased, and an unexpected cold enveloped her. She looked around, but there was no one else around. She slowly descended the stone steps that led to a small underground chamber, an atmosphere of oppression enveloping her as she went down. The crypt was more than it looked. It wasn't just an old, forgotten building, it seemed to have been designed for something else. Upon reaching the bottom, Clara found a mausoleum, covered with dust and cobwebs. The stone was marked with old inscriptions, almost unreadable, but still imposing. She touched the surface, and a feeling of repulsion ran through her hand, as if an invisible force was trying to push her away. She began to examine the place more closely. There, among the traces of old offerings and broken relics, she found something that made her stop in shock, an aged photograph of a child. The face, although partially faded, was unmistakable. It was Alice, but in the photo she looked older, maybe 10 years old. Beside her, a shadowy figure was in the shadow, a presence that Clara could not identify. The guardian? Or something even darker? Clara backed off, taking the picture with her. She needed to get out of there before something happened. When he turned to climb again, something unexpected happened. The door of the crypt closed violently behind it, as if pushed by an invisible force. She tried to open, but the door was locked, and panic took hold of her body. The sound of the wind became more and more distant, and the silence of the crypt seemed to swallow all the sound around it. It was then that she heard a low, almost imperceptible sigh coming from inside the crypt. Clara shuddered and, with her heart beating hard, looked at the opening where a shadow was moving. Something was inside with her, something that watched her. She turned the door handle once more, but this time the door gave way, as if the force that had kept it locked had disappeared. Clara ran out of the crypt, breathing with difficulty, panic taking hold of her body. The garden looked darker, the shadows denser. She felt something was chasing her. On the way back to the mansion, she saw Alice at the window, staring at her with those deep, empty eyes, as if she knew exactly what had happened. Clara tried to convince herself that she was getting paranoid, but the vision of the girl made her doubt her own sanity. She felt watched, as if she was being watched, not only by the house, but by something much older and evil. The guardian was closer than she thought, and now he knew that Clara was in her territory. She needed to act fast, before it was too late. Clara could not sleep that night. She was turning in bed, listening to the sounds of the mansion and the wind outside, as if the air itself were trying to tell her something. The photograph of Alice, with the shadowy figure by her side, was now on her bedside table. She could not stop looking at the face of Alice, so familiar and yet so different from the child she knew. Something was very wrong, but what exactly? The next morning, Lady Blackwood approached Clara with a cold smile, asking her to have breakfast with them. Lord Blackwood remained in his usual voice, and Alice seemed quieter than ever, as if she had been absorbed by a deep silence. Clara tried to keep her composure, but she felt there was something else going on there, something Mrs. Blackwood did not want her to find out. The conversation between them was bland, without further explanation, but Clara could not ignore the growing feeling that she was being observed. After a while, Clara decided she needed to confront the Blackwoods. They knew more than they were saying, and she would not leave without understanding what was happening there. She asked politely Lady Blackwood to speak alone. "I found something in the crypt last night," Clara began, trying to look calm, though her voice falters. "A photograph of Alice. And an esoteric symbol, something very old. I don't understand what's going on here." Lady Blackwood seemed to be enraged, but her face remained impassive, like a porcelain mask. She looked at Clara with a piercing look, as if weighing her words before answering. "You don't understand, my dear. This is something that has been passed down through generations. Our family has been marked since long before Alice was born. The guardian, he chooses those with whom he wants to connect. Alice is not an ordinary child. She never was." Clara felt a wave of unbelief, but also of fear. What was happening in that mansion? What was this guardian? She felt her stomach tighten upon hearing those words, as if a thin line between the real and the supernatural were breaking irreversibly. Alice was chosen from birth. The guardian took her when she was still small, and now he returns whenever she calls him. What you saw in the photograph was not an accident. He has the power to seize the souls of children, to use them as birds, feeding their thirst for more souls. Lady Blackwood seemed to have given herself to destiny. Clara didn't quite understand what she was saying, but the words seemed to resonate with a deep weight. It was as if she were confessing an old and bitter story, something she knew she could not change. But, what does he want with Alice? What's happening to her? Clara asked, her voice trembling. The child he chooses does not age. She is in a state between life and death, and he keeps her like that, using her as a kind of agent for his own needs. Alice is no longer just a girl. She is the receptacle, the instrument through which the guardian feeds. Clara tried to assimilate all that, but it seemed that reality became more distorted with each word. Fear grew within her, but also an urgency. She needed to act before it was too late. Alice was in danger, and now Clara knew what she had to do. She had to protect the girl at all costs. When Mrs. Blackwood finished speaking, Clara stood up abruptly. The mansion was a maze of secrets, but the crypt in the garden was where everything was happening. Alice was connected to this dark being, and the crypt was the center of it all. That's where she needed to go. Clara found Alice again upstairs, sitting by the window. Her eyes were glazed, and Clara knew that the girl was not fully there. She was being observed, possessed, perhaps, by something that was not human. "Let's get out of here, Alice," Clara said firmly, trying to grab the girl's hand. "I'll help you." But Alice, with an empty smile, shook her head. "You can't help me. The guardian has already decided." His voice was soft, but his words froze Clara's blood. "He found me. Clara knew she had no more time. She dragged Alice to the garden, where the path led her, not knowing exactly what she would find in the crypt. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step, and the mansion seemed to breathe around it as if it were alive. When they reached the crypt, the stone door was open, as if the gates of hell themselves had been opened. Inside, the air was thick, loaded with a musty smell and rot. Clara felt a presence, as if something was waiting, something that was not human. The feeling of being observed, of being consumed by an invisible force, almost paralyzed her. She came in with Alice in her arms, facing the darkness that seemed to swallow everything around her. The footsteps echoed on the crypt walls, and Clara noticed that as she advanced, the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting as if they were alive. Then, in a corner of the crypt, Clara saw what she most feared, the Guardian. He was there, a hooded figure, his shape indistinct, but his piercing and empty gaze crossed it. He smiled, a smile that made the blood of Clara freeze. The Guardian was not just a creature from another world, he was something much older, something that existed before death itself. "You should have stayed away," the Guardian whispered, his voice deep and cavernous. Clara tried to protect Alice, but something stopped her moving. The Guardian was stronger than she thought. He was evil in its purest form, and she was just a piece in his game. Time was running out. Clara felt her breath accelerate, and the dread paralyzed her as the Guardian approached slowly, his hooded figure emanating an oppressive presence that seemed to consume the air around. Alice, in her arms, was inert, her eyes empty of emotion, as if the child that Clara knew was completely absent, taken by something much deeper and evil. The Guardian stepped forward and spoke, his voice like a whisper torn by the wind, as if echoing from a place beyond time. "She already belongs to me, Nanny. There is no more hope for her. The cycle is complete." Clara, with her heart racing and mind desperate, looked at Alice. She looked so small and fragile, but her skin was cold to the touch, and her breath was almost imperceptible. Clara knew something had to be done, that the fight was far from over. It didn't matter what the Guardian was, what he wanted. She would not allow the girl to be consumed by him. "No!" Clara cried, holding Alice tighter. "I won't let you take her." The Guardian leaned slightly, as if he was amused by your resistance. "You do not understand. I am the Guardian of the crypt, and everything that enters my domains belongs to me. Souls, children, they become mine forever. Do you think you can save this corrupted soul? It's not a child anymore. It is the key to what will come." Clara felt the pressure on her chest increase. The shadows around the crypt seemed to stretch, writhing with a supernatural energy, as if the space itself was being distorted. The Guardian was an impossible force to comprehend, an entity that transcended the laws of death and life. But she could not give up. Could not let Alice be consumed by it, not in this way. She looked at the wall of the crypt, her eyes looking for something that could use. It was then that she saw the symbol engraved on the stone, the same one she had found at the entrance. He was everywhere, as if it were part of the crypt's own structure, a ritualistic mark. Clara remembered the story that Lady Blackwood had mentioned. The Guardian needed the children to feed his thirst for souls, but it took a sacrifice to keep the cycle going. She needed to stop it. Clara took a step back, taking Alice with her, trying not to be taken by the terror that dominated her. "I'll end it. I'll break the cycle." "You can't," replied the Guardian, his voice getting lower, more threatening. "He is beyond you, beyond anything you can imagine." Clara didn't listen. She was with Alice in her arms, but the girl was now like a dead weight, as if life was slowly drained from her. Clara had a single chance, and she knew it. She needed to destroy the crypt, the center of the Guardian's power. Without hesitation, Clara ran to the opposite wall, where the symbol was most pronounced. She knelt before him and began to scratch the stones with her nails, trying desperately to disfigure the mark. When his hand started bleeding, the Guardian watched her in silence, but Clara knew he was losing control. He was weak. He did not expect resistance. The crypt began to shake. A deaf bang reverberated through the walls, as if something was trying to break the structure of the earth itself. Clara did not look back, did not dare. She continued, ignoring the pain that the stones caused in her hands, until finally the symbol began to crumble. Lines and marks broke, and a wave of black and icy energy exploded through the crypt, as if all the evil that resided there was trying to free itself. The Guardian was roaring, a voice full of fury, and the air around it became heavy, as if death were approaching. The shadows began to rise, almost tangible, trying to grab her, but Clara did not stop. She felt a greater force, an invisible light guiding her, as if it were the last spark of hope. With a cry of effort, Clara gave the last blow, and the symbol completely disintegrated. The crypt exploded in a wave of energy that threw it back. The shadows were dispelled, and the air suddenly became clear, as if the weight of centuries had been removed. Clara was on the floor, panting but without pain. Alice was again in her arms, breathing normally, as if the nightmare had ended. The child was awake, his eyes now shining with the light of life, free from the emptiness that had taken hold of him. When Claire got up, the crypt was empty. There were no more traces of the Guardian, and the mansion seemed to have calmed down. The garden was brighter, and the tension in the air slowly dissipated. Clara felt a sense of relief, but also loss. She had won, but knew that she would never be the same. Alice, now free of the possession, looked at Clara with a genuine smile, as if she finally recognized the nanny. "You saved me, Clara," said Alice in her soft voice but full of gratitude. "Thank you." Clara looked at her, and for the first time since she entered that mansion, she felt a deep peace. The Guardian had been defeated, but the mark of that place would never disappear from his soul. As the sun set on the horizon, Clara knew it was over. The cycle was broken, and the child was free. But Clara, with her breath still, knew that the fight against evil would never really be won. She would go on, but always remember that day, the fight, and the Guardian who inhabited the crypt. The story was not yet completely finished. I never liked isolated places. I always thought they had something disturbing, a strange feeling that makes me alert. When I was hired to look after the children at the cottage, I did not know exactly what to expect. What made me even more uncomfortable was the fact that the house is so distant. It is miles from the city, hidden in the middle of a dense forest. And besides, the owner of the house, a polite man with a soft voice, always seemed eager to say goodbye to me, as if he was in a hurry, as if he wanted me to leave. It left me with a chill that I could not ignore. But the pay was good, and the children looked lovely. And who would refuse such a simple job in such a quiet place? Did not know what was coming. When I arrived, the house looked even bigger than in the pictures. The high windows, the dark wooden doors, everything there had an air of mystery, as if it was keeping secrets for a long time. The garden was well maintained, but the trees around the house seemed to grow in a disordered way, as if they were trying to swallow the old structure. I was greeted by Lucy and Tommy. They were quieter than the kids I used to take care of, but there was something captivating about them. Lucy looked much older than her age, with eyes that seemed to weigh more than normal. Tommy was younger, but his smile was cold, almost as if he was always hiding something. Their mother gave me quick instructions, saying that they would go out for an event and that I could prepare the children to sleep at 9 o'clock. They needed to rest, and I was supposed to keep everything under control until dawn. The mother spoke in such a hurry, as if she already knew it would be too late for me to realize something wrong. When she left, silence took over the house, a silence that seemed to carry a strange weight. The children soon settled in, going to their rooms without complaining. Apparently, it was an ordinary night, but there was something wrong with the stillness that surrounded that place. The air was heavy, and the silence seemed a weight on my shoulders. After putting the children to sleep, I decided to explore the house a little more. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but something told me that I should. I passed by the living room, which was adorned with old furniture and family pictures. The pictures on the wall were all black and white, and the people in the photos seemed to be watching me with a disturbing intensity. Somehow, I felt that those pictures were not just there to remember the past, but to hold something, or someone. I looked in the kitchen, where I found a door leading to the basement. I didn't have the courage to open it. Something about that dark staircase made me want to turn around immediately, but I don't know why. Instead, I went upstairs and passed through the children's rooms. Both were silent, but the mood in their rooms seemed dense, as if the walls were breathing. As I closed the door to Lucy's room, I felt a presence behind me. I looked quickly, but there was no one. Just the dark and empty corridor. I went back to the room, trying to get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. It was when I saw, through the living room window, that the car of the children's parents was no longer in the garage. I got weird. They had left in the morning and told me that they would come back late. The strangest thing, however, was that there were no signs of them having gone. What was going on here? I decided to call them, but the phone line was cut. I was frozen for a moment, looking at the phone that made just a strange sound, as if trying to connect to something that was no longer there. The house became even quieter. The kind of silence that swallows you, makes you feel as if you are being watched, even when you know you are alone. And for the first time since I arrived, I started to wonder if I was really alone. The night fell heavily, as if the house itself was swallowing the outside world. The shadows stretched across the walls, and the sound of the wind outside seemed more like a whisper, trying to infiltrate the cracks in the windows. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The discomfort I was trying to push away now seemed to envelop me, suffocating every thought. Lucy and Tommy were in bed, but something about the way they settled me worried. They did not move, nor even breathe like normal children. The silence between us seemed to be full of something unsaid, as if they were waiting for me to realize something I had not yet understood. I decided to take a last look at the house before trying to sleep. I went to the kitchen, where a lamp hung from the ceiling, illuminating weak water spots on the floor. The air was cold, but it wasn't the kind of normal cold that you feel in an old house. It was a cold almost palpable, something that made the skin shiver and the hair stand. I went through the window and watched the darkness outside, the forest that seemed to swallow the house every minute. It was as if the tree trunks themselves were bending to observe the house. The sound of the wind now seemed more like a distant lament. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. A slight drag, as if someone was walking barefoot in the corridor. The kind of sound you hear in an old house, but there's something about it that made me stop. The sound stopped immediately, but the feeling that someone was there was unmistakable. I tried to convince myself that it was just the normal noise of the house, the doors adjusting with the heat or the wind pressure. But as the night went on, I knew it wasn't that. I decided to go into the living room to try and relax. But when I arrived, a strange feeling took over me. The pictures on the walls looked more intense. The look of people in the images seemed more penetrating, more curious, as if they were watching me with an uncomfortable interest. I was being watched, that was clear. No matter where I looked, there always seemed to be something moving in the shadows. That feeling was interrupted by a high-pitched sound, like a muffled scream, coming from one of the rooms. My heart pounded. I ran upstairs, but when I got near Lucy's room, everything was quiet again. She was lying there, eyes closed, as if she had fallen asleep. But something was wrong with the way she stood on the bed. It was completely immobile, more rigid than normal, as if it were a statue. I walked through Tommy's room door. He was awake, sitting in bed, looking at me with wide eyes, fixed but empty. He did not move, nor made a sound. He just looked at me, as if he was waiting for me, as if he knew I was seeing something beyond what I wanted to see. Will you leave us alone? His voice came low, but full of a weight that made me feel a shiver. I tried to ignore, tried to give him a reassuring smile, but the words did not come. I could only look at him, at that empty gaze, as if something inside of him had died. The feeling of being observed, watched, intensified in an almost oppressive way. I left the room as quickly as possible, but Tommy's words echoed in my mind. Something was there, inside that house, waiting for me to notice. I went down into the room again, but something stopped me. There was a faint line of light coming from the front door as if it were half open. I was sure that I had closed that door when I came in. The air was even heavier now, and the sound of the wind outside seemed like a distant cry. I approached the door and pulled it, but before I could see what was on the other side, the phone rang. A low, muffled sound, as if it were coming from inside the house, but from a place that I could not identify. I wanted to run away. I wanted to leave the house and not look back. But with each step, the weight of silence became more unbearable. The children were quiet, but I felt a presence in every corner of the house, a feeling that somewhere something was moving in the shadows. Before I could react, the phone stopped ringing. And in that silence, a single word echoed in my mind. Revenge. The silence in the house was oppressive, as if she was waiting for me to talk, to ask what was going on, but I knew that if I did, I would never have the answers I was looking for. The wind outside was howling, but inside the house everything was quiet, as if the world had stopped spinning in there. I couldn't look at Lucy and Tommy anymore without feeling a growing pressure on their chest. They were different, colder, more distant. And every moment that passed, it seemed they were watching me, as if they knew something about me that I had not yet discovered. That's when I started to notice the little things. The details that didn't scare me before, but now made me shudder. The pictures on the wall, always so fixed, now seemed more vivid, with the eyes of people in them even deeper and more penetrating. I could no longer ignore the feeling that I was being watched. I went down to the living room and stood there for a while, trying to calm my mind. But then the front door opened slowly, as if pushed by an invisible force. A sharp cold spread through the house, and moonlight lit the entrance, creating grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. It was when I saw the key on the table, an old, dusty key with a tag that said, "Basement." I knew I should not go there. Something inside me screamed for me to stay away from that place. But curiosity consumed me, and before I knew it, I was holding the key and walking down the stairs that led to the basement. The air was even heavier as it went down. Every step rattled, every movement seemed to be heard by the house itself. I reached the basement door and, with a feeling that I already knew what I would find, I turned the key in the lock and opened the door. The smell of mold and rot invaded me as soon as I entered. The basement was large, larger than I had imagined, and it was full of old boxes and furniture. But what caught my attention was the newspapers scattered on the floor. Old, yellowed by time. I started to browse them, not knowing what I was looking for, until a headline caught my attention. Family leaves home after mysterious tragedy. Disappearance of children unexplained. My stomach turned. I was reading about the family that lived there before, the family that had mysteriously disappeared. But the words that most impacted me were those that came right below. Neighbors claim the house is cursed. They say the children never left. The words reverberated in my mind, like an echo that did not want to dissipate. I was in the house of a family that had disappeared, but actually it didn't explain what was happening there now. I needed to understand more. I needed to know what those kids really were. That's when I heard a low, sweet voice coming from behind me. "You found." I came quickly, but there was no one there. Only silence. A dense darkness that seemed to swallow everything around me. When I looked up the stairs, Lucy was standing there with her eyes fixed on me, but she didn't seem like the same child as before. His eyes were empty, and the expression on his face was not that of a frightened child. It was a presence, something much older and much more malicious than I could comprehend. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was cold, without emotion, as if she was talking about something distant, something that did not concern me, but I could no longer ignore. I tried to get out, but my legs were heavy, as if something was preventing me from moving. The basement door closed itself with a bang, and for a moment I was paralyzed in the dark. When I lit the flashlight on my phone, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The basement wall was marked. They scratched it with something sharp, that left deep marks. What shocked me most was that, in the center of the marks, were the names of Lucy and Tommy, but they weren't just their names. There was something else, something I didn't understand, something like an invocation. A sense of panic took me, and I knew there was no turning back. Lucy and Tommy were not children anymore. They were not alive. The house was full of secrets, and now I had found one of them. The phone rang again, but this time the sound wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from inside me, something I was trying to communicate. I knew what I had to do. I had to get out of that house. But when I looked back, I saw Lucy and Tommy standing in the hall with their empty eyes fixed on me. They were no longer alone. I was no longer alone. The air was heavy. The sound of breathing was the only one I could hear, the only sound capable of breaking the unbearable silence. Lucy and Tommy stood before me now, their faces unchanging, with those lifeless eyes as if watching me in a silent expectation. They were no longer children. They were no more what they seemed to be. I knew that now. What I did not know was what they wanted from me. I tried to move, but my feet were firmly planted on the ground, as if the house was preventing me from leaving. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stand there, motionless, as if an invisible force held me. You won't leave." Lucy's voice sounded again, lower, more distant, but with a tone that made every word weigh like a hammer. She no longer looked like a child. Her voice had something old, somber, boring. Something that did not come from childish innocence, but from something older, deeper. Something I should not understand. The cold was increasing. The air was dense, saturated with the smell of wet and rotten earth, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow the house. The sounds of the winds outside were replaced by a whisper, a low murmur, which seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The voices were so many, but there was no one in the house but us. Suddenly, a faint light began to shine at the end of the corridor, as if someone had lit a candle. I walked towards her, still with my eyes fixed on the children, who did not move, but their presence was like a crushing weight on me. When I got to the lit room, I saw what was really behind the door that I had avoided so much. The wall was covered with yellowish pictures. They were not pictures of an ordinary family, but of people who seemed to be in constant state of suffering. Each image was marked by something I could not identify, something that seemed to have been added later, something that seemed recent. As if the photos were, somehow, still alive. And then I saw what had been hidden behind these images, a door. Small, hidden, as if part of an illusion, a part of the house that should never be found. I knew I should not open it. But something, an unexplained force, pushed me forward. The key was on a table, as if it were waiting for me. I took it with trembling hands and inserted in the lock, feeling a shiver go through my spine. When the door opened, a heat wave enveloped me. Not the heat of summer, but the warmth of something that had been kept for a long time, something that had been there waiting. Inside, what I saw made my stomach turn. The floor was covered with something slimy, sticky. And in the center of the room there was an old crib. Inside the crib, something moved. It wasn't a baby. It was a shadow. And on top of the crib, a name was written, Tommy. I looked back, and saw the children. They were standing there, not moving a muscle, but their eyes were fixed on me, more penetrating, more thirsty. You will stay with us now. Tommy's voice sounded, but it wasn't his. It was a more serious voice, a voice full of anger and a need that I did not understand. He smiled, but there was no joy in his smile. Only hatred. Deep hatred. The shadows around began to move, creeping up walls and across the floor. They were no longer normal shadows. They had shapes, contours, as if they were waiting to take full shape. It was as if the house was changing, growing, expanding around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. I was paralyzed, not only by fear but by the realization that there was no escape. The house would not let me go. Not after all I've found. And then a cold hand came over my shoulder. I looked away, and saw Lucy, but she was no longer a child. His body was distorted, as if it were made of shadows and pieces of nightmares. His eyes were empty, as if they had been torn out, and his mouth was full of sharp bloody teeth. Stay with us. It's your destiny. Her voice was a whisper, but at the same time it seemed like a cry, an endless echo, as if it had been uttered by 1,000 other mouths. I tried to fight, I tried to scream, but the hands of the shadows began to drag me into the darkness, into the house where I knew I would never see the light again. The last thing I saw was Tommy's smile, an empty expression, without compassion. And then the door closed, and the house was silent. The house was empty again. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of children calling. And the promise of revenge never fades. It was a cold autumn night when Emily, a 22-year-old girl, arrived at that isolated house in the hills. She still didn't know much about the family she was going to work for, but the offer seemed good, a full-time nanny to look after an 8-year-old girl in a house far from the city. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cunningham, said they were going away for a few days and needed someone responsible to stay with their daughter, Sophie. The payment was generous, and with tight bills, Emily did not hesitate to accept. When the car stopped in front of the big mansion, she could not help but feel a shiver. The house was huge, imposing in appearance, with high windows that seemed to observe what was happening outside. The stone walls were covered with vines, and the lights in the windows lit up softly, almost as if the house was alive waiting for it. Emily hesitated for a moment, feeling annoyed, but soon convinced herself that she was just nervous. After all, it was her first job as a nanny. Mr. Cunningham appeared at the door, smiling warmly. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a friendly expression, but something in his eyes seemed distant, as if there were more going on there than he wanted to let it show. "Emily, welcome. Sophie is waiting for you. She's a good girl, it won't give you any trouble," he said, with a reassuring but almost rushed tone. Emily followed him inside, feeling strange with the coldness of the environment. The entrance hall was large, with antique furniture and an imposing chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. Everything in the house seemed heavy, immersed in a distant past, as if the objects there were frozen in time. The walls were decorated with framed portraits of people Emily did not recognize, their looks seeming to follow her movements as she walked down the hall. "Sophie is already upstairs," said Mr. Cunningham, interrupting his thoughts. "She must be asleep by now, but don't worry. She won't give you any trouble. Just stay calm, and anything is just call me." He led her up the stairs, and Emily went up, feeling the weight of the house on her shoulders. When they reached the second floor, he took her to a room separate from Sophie's. "This will be your room," said Mr. Cunningham. "You'll sleep here, and tomorrow when Sophie wakes up she'll enjoy spending time with you. And avoid going out too much at dawn. The house can be a bit scary." Emily didn't know what he meant by that, but he didn't ask questions. He said goodbye and went downstairs. Emily walked into the room and closed the door behind her. The room was simple but cozy, with a large bed and a window overlooking the front garden. She approached the window and looked out, watching the shadows that danced in the trees in the wind. Something about the house still bothered her, but she soon forced herself to relax, aware that she was there to work, not to think of her own fears. Shortly after, Emily went downstairs to check if Sophie was already asleep. She found the girl in a spacious room, large bed with a soft and delicate decoration. Sophie was still, with her eyes closed, lying in the fetal position. Emily came to the bed, put on the blankets and looked at the girl who seemed so quiet that she hardly felt real. "Good night, Sophie," whispered Emily with a soft smile. Sophie muttered something but didn't wake up. She went back up to her room, feeling relieved that the night was beginning calmly. But the house looked strangely quiet, more than usual. The wind outside increased, and the sound of rain beating on the windows brought a feeling of discomfort. Emily knew she shouldn't be afraid, but the heavy environment and the whispers of the wind made it all the more unsettling. It was then that something caught his attention. As she walked down a dark corridor toward her room, she noticed a large mirror hanging on the wall, reflecting the light from the lamps in the hallway. He was out of place, in a far corner, as if he were part of something that didn't fit with the rest of the house. Emily stood before him, feeling a growing curiosity. It was an old mirror with a golden frame worn by time. When she looked in the mirror, something strange happened. For a moment, she did not see her own reflection. Instead, something else appeared on the glass, a dark, faceless figure staring at her. Emily stepped back, panting. She turned quickly to look back, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty. The nanny was still, heart racing. She tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of light or an illusion caused by fatigue, but could not ignore the feeling that there was something wrong with that mirror. Something that was beyond simple perception. With her mind still agitated, she returned to her room, locked the door and lay down in bed. But the mirror, with its disturbing image, was still in her mind, and she knew that something in that house was about to be revealed. The night went on slowly. Emily tried to fall asleep, but the feeling of restlessness did not leave her alone. The silence of the house seemed dense, as if each wall was keeping an old and heavy secret. She was turning in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to get her mind away from the mirror. What she had seen was impossible to ignore. She wondered if she was just imagining things, but the feeling that there was something wrong in the house persisted, a subtle presence watching her. Gradually, sleep was coming, but soon turned into disturbing nightmares. Fragmented images, flashes of a dark figure, and the mirror reflecting something that should not be there. Emily woke up sweaty, her heart beating hard. She looked at the clock. It was late in the evening, and the house was again in absolute silence. But as I looked out the door of the room, the corridor in front of me seemed different. As if something had changed. With a sigh, Emily rose from her bed, determined to distract herself from the growing anxiety. She quickly got dressed and, before fear took over her thoughts, decided to take a walk around the house to investigate. Perhaps the fresh air of the night or the simple act of moving made her feel calmer. The corridor was dark, illuminated only by weak lamps that could barely dissipate the darkness. As the nanny passed by it, she noticed something that made her stop in place. The mirror. He was still there, hanging on the wall, reflecting the little light that spread through the corridor. Emily hesitated for a moment, but after a deep breath, she approached, caught up in curiosity. When his eyes fixed on the mirror, the feeling of discomfort intensified. It was as if the surface of the glass were distorted, as if she wasn't seeing her own reflection in a natural way. This time, there was no dark figure. On the contrary, something different appeared. The image of a young woman, with shaggy hair and old clothes, moved slowly in the reflection, as if trying to escape. Emily swallowed dry, stomach turned. When she quickly turned back, the corridor was empty. There was no one there. The heart was beating hard, and fear began to take hold of her mind. She felt an urge to run away from there, but something held her. The mirror seemed to call her, as if it was drawing her attention to a secret she still did not understand. Trying to keep calm, Emily moved away from the mirror and went into the living room where she had seen some books about the history of the house. Perhaps if she knew more about the place, she would be able to understand what was happening. On the shelf, she found some old volumes that looked like reports of past residents, but when she picked up one of the books, a piece of paper fell, yellowed and worn by time. It was a letter, handwritten, with hastily written letters, as if the writer was desperate. Emily read in silence. Never look in the mirror. The house demands something from us. Once you look at it, you will see what you don't want to see, and it will be too late. The nannies always disappear. The house won't let them go. Try to escape and you'll be part of it. She swallowed dry, feeling a cold running through her spine. The letter did not specifically mention the mirror, but the message was clear. Something was happening there, and that mirror seemed to be the key to the curse that haunted the house. Emily se afastada estante, seu olhar fixo no corredor. A sensação de estar sendo observada era insuportável. Ela sabia que precisava fazer algo, mas o medo comunicava a domina. O que teria acontecido com as outras babas? O que ela não estava entendendo? Ela precisava saber mais. Decidiu voltar ao corredor e examinar o espelho mais de perto. Quando se aproximou novamente, o vidro parecia ainda mais distorcido, como se estivesse em movimento. E então, uma visão aterradora. A figura de mulher que ela vira anteriormente estava mais clara agora. Era uma baba, com os olhos arregalados de medo, olhando diretamente para Emily. Ela parecia desesperada, como se estivesse pedindo ajuda. Com grito abafado, Emily deu passo para trás, mas o espelho refletiu algo que a fez parar completamente. A mulher do reflexo parecia estar tentando falar, suas bocas se movendo, mas o som não chegava aos ouvidos de Emily. Ela não podia ouvir suas palavras, mas o terror nos olhos da figura era inconfundível. A mulher aponta para a porta, e, por momento, Emily teve a sensação de que ela deveria correr para lá, fugir daquela casa e nunca mais voltar. Mas, ao dar, passo dirico a porta, ela sentiu uma força invisível puxá-la de volta para o espelho, como se algo estivesse dizendo, você já está perdida. Ela se viru e, pela primeira vez, notou algo novo. O espelho parecia se estender além de sua moldura, como se estivesse seguindo a realidade ao seu redor. A parede atrás do espelho parecia distorcida, e, por instante, Emily não tinha mais certeza de onde terminava a casa e onde começava o reflexo. Com o coração batendo descontroladamente, ela soube que a resposta estava naquele espelho. Mas a pergunta que surgia sua mente era, o que aconteceria quando ela finalmente entendesse o que ele estava tentando mostrar? Emily could no longer get away from the feeling that the mirror was drawing her to a destination from which there was no escape. She felt a growing pressure, as if the house and the mirror itself were shaping her thoughts, forcing her to see something she should not. The letter she had found seemed to be a warning, but it was also a key to understanding what had happened there, with the other nannies, with the people in the house. With herself. She quickly moved away from the mirror, her mind full of doubts and fear. But deep down, a sense of urgency was driving her. She knew that she could not ignore it anymore. Something very old and very dark was happening in the house, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. Emily walked down the hall to the end, where there was a dark wooden door that seemed to have been neglected for many years. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed like the only option. The door was slightly open, and the sound of the wind made it creak, creating an even more oppressive atmosphere. With a deep sigh, she pushed the door. The room was dark and stuffy, with the smell of mildew and moisture in the air. In the corner of the room, there was a bookcase with more old books, all dusty and in a deplorable state. Emily walked carefully to them, and it was there that she found something that stopped her. On a low shelf, there was a wooden box with a rusty lock. She knew she needed to open it, as if her very survival depended on it. The box was locked, but when she looked closer, Emily noticed a key hanging from a rope on the table. Without hesitation, he took the key and with trembling hands put it in the lock. Inside the box, he found several letters and newspaper clippings. One of the letters was dated 1942 and it seemed to be from a nanny named Helen, whose name she had never heard before. The letter was scribbled urgently, and the words seemed almost illegible, as if the author had written in haste, afraid of being discovered. I know they are watching. Every move of mine. The house feeds on us. I can't leave. I can't trust what I see in the mirror. He showed me what happened to the others. They can't see. They can't know. I can't tell. But once you look, you become part of it. There is no going back. Emily's heart accelerated, and her stomach turned. She had found a testimony, a proof that another nanny had been through the same hell. But the most terrifying was what was implied in Helen's words. The mirror not only showed something from the past, it had the power to hold people in the house. That woman had tried to run away, just as she wanted, but the house held it back. Desperate, Emily picked up one of the newspaper clippings, dated 1939. The headline read, "Nanny mysteriously disappears at Cunningham Mansion, no trace." Next to it, there was a black and white photo of a woman, a smiling nanny who didn't seem to have anything special. But her name was there, clearly visible, Elizabeth Horn. The clipping continued to say that Elizabeth had disappeared without a trace, and that the police had investigated, but the only thing they found was a letter, similar to Helen's, indicating that she also believed the house was haunted. Emily felt a wave of panic. She tried to understand what was happening, but could not put all the pieces together. There was something much bigger at stake, something much deeper than she could have imagined. She put everything back in the box and ran back to the hall, her heart pounding. She needed to find Sophie, she needed to make sure the girl was okay. The feeling that the house was about to swallow everything and everyone seemed stronger and stronger, and the image of the woman in the mirror, with desperate eyes, did not leave his mind. Upon arriving at Sophie's room, Emily found the door ajar. She entered silently, trying not to wake the girl. But Sophie was not in bed. The room was empty, except for the faint moonlight that filtered through the curtains. Emily approached the window and looked out into the garden outside, but saw nothing but dark shadows. The panic suddenly engulfed her. She called for Sophie, but her voice sounded muffled, almost without echo. And it was when she looked at the mirror in the corner of the room, the same old mirror that she had seen in the hallway, that her breath stopped. In the reflection, there was no girl, but a different image. The woman with shaggy hair, the same as the corridor, was there, watching Emily with a fixed and empty look. And at the bottom, Sophie was standing with her eyes closed, holding an object in her hand. Emily stepped back, horrified. It was then that she heard a low, muffled laugh as if it were the voice of a child. When I looked in the mirror again, Sophie was no longer there. Now, only the woman with darker eyes than ever before, looking directly at Emily. The nanny turned quickly, but there was no more Sophie in the room. She was alone. The mirror reflected the truth she feared: the house had a terrible power, and no one who entered it, especially the nannies, could ever escape. Emily no longer knew what was real. The room was empty, the mirror only reflected a gloomy figure she recognized too well. It was the woman in the mirror, her eyes deep and empty, as if they were sucking the very life of Emily. She looked around frantically, but Sophie was nowhere. What had happened to the girl? Had she been taken, or was the mirror playing with her mind? Everything seemed confused, as if the house was becoming a prison from which there was no way out. She ran to the door of the room and opened it with force. The corridor was dark and quiet, but something moved in the gloom. The nanny came forward, trying to control the growing panic in her chest. She needed to find Sophie, she needed to get out of that damn house. As she walked down the hall, she noticed that the walls seemed to narrow, as if the house was shrinking around her, swallowing up everything possible. The air was heavy and humid, and Emily felt a growing pressure on her head. Each step seemed to echo endlessly, reverberating in his ears in a sharp and strange way. She knew that she was being watched, but did not know by whom or what. As she reached the end of the hall, Emily saw the living room door ajar. Inside, the shadows seemed denser, stronger. She hesitated, but there was no other choice. She pushed the door with a push and came in. What he saw made his stomach turn. In the center of the room, Sophie was standing still, as if she were a statue. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the void, and she did not move, as if frozen in time. The girl was holding an object in her small hands, but what Emily saw made her throat close. It was a key. The same key she had found before, which opened the box where the old letters were. "You need to go, Emily," said Sophie, her voice calmer than it should be. But his words sounded distant, as if they were being spoken from another place. "You cannot stay here." Emily took a step forward, but before she could say anything, the girl turned slowly. His eyes were completely black, without brightness, without life. The reflection in the mirror seemed to have taken the girl, as if she had been possessed by something much older and evil. Sophie smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was the smile of the woman in the mirror, the same one who had tried to escape from the house years before. "You're so close, Emily." "It's only one step away," said Sophie, her voice echoing with a threatening softness. The nanny looked back at the mirror on the wall, reflecting not only the room, but something she was afraid to see. In the glass, there were now two figures, Sophie, with empty eyes, and the woman of the past, a nanny who seemed to have the same look of suffering. The mirror showed not only what was happening at that moment, but what had happened to all the other nannies who had passed by. They were stuck there on the surface of the glass, condemned to repeat the same cycle of despair. The mirror was not just an object. It was a portal. a portal to the past, to what happened with the other women who disappeared. The house not only held their souls, but also forced them to be new nannies, repeating the cycle, taking new victims, and so on. Emily felt her breath getting short. There was no way out. She had seen what happened to the others, and now she understood. The woman in the mirror was the same one that Sophie had become. It was the price that everyone paid to enter that house: freedom stolen, soul imprisoned. She ran to the door, trying to escape, but the house seemed to close on her. With each step I took, the corridor became tighter, the shadows denser. And then reality distorted even more. The mirror appeared in every corner of the house, reflecting the same scene: Sophie, the woman, and herself. Emily no longer knew if she was herself, if she was being reflected in that mirror, or if she was becoming a part of that eternal cycle. She paused for a moment, looking at the key that Sophie still held. It was the key to the exit, the key that she thought had the power to release her. But Sophie, or the creature in her place, laughed softly. "There's no way out, Emily. The mirror always takes the new nannies. You knew that from the start." Emily closed her eyes, the pain and despair mixing. When she opened again, the reflection in the mirror was no longer yours. She saw herself there, but it was not her. It was the woman who had disappeared before, and now the house had her face, her eyes empty. The cycle was complete. She had become the next babysitter, stuck forever in the mirror, waiting for another woman to come who, like her, would seek answers and meet death. The house now had its soul, and like all others it was doomed to be reflected on the glass surface for eternity.